The formula for finding the area of a circle is to square the radius, radius squared, and then multiply that by pi. And there's a few different ways to think about why this formula makes sense, but this one is my favorite. So let's say we have a circle with a radius of 2. Now let's say we draw another radius at 90 degrees to the first one. Because radii are always equivalent, this one also equals 2. And then let's think of those two radii as two sides of a square. The area of that square would be 2 squared, which is 4, which is also the radius times the radius, or the radius squared. Now, let's say we drew 3 more squares to cover the entire circle. So here we would have 4 squares, and each of them would have an area of the radius squared, or 2 squared, which is 4. So the area of the 4 squares would be 4 times 4, or 16. However, what if we wanted to find the area of the circle? You can see that it's not quite 4 times 4, and in fact, it just happens to be pi, or approximately 3.14, times the radius squared. So now let's talk about some types of questions you might encounter when working with the formula for area of a circle. Our first question asks us to find the area of a circle with a diameter of 6. And this is taken from Khan Academy, so you can see that our options are to answer in terms of pi, or use 3.14 and enter our answer as a decimal. So we always start with our formula, a equals pi r squared. Then we write down the information we have. In this case, we're given that the diameter is 6, but because the equation uses the radius, we also need to identify the radius, which would be 3, or half of the diameter. Once we have the radius, we can plug it into the formula, so area equals pi times the radius, or 3 squared. And since 3 squared equals 9, we now know that area equals 9 pi. So at this point, we could put in 9 pi as our answer, or we could do 9 times 3.14, which equals 28.26. And remembering, of course, that we're finding area, so our answer would be in square units, whichever form we choose to input. A second question asks us to find the area of a circle, but we're given the circumference, which in this case is 6.28 units. So again, we always start with our formula for area, and we start with what we know. In this case, we know the circumference of the circle is 6.28 units. Because we need the radius in order to find area, that means we need to take our circumference and use it to find the diameter. Remembering that pi times diameter is circumference. Therefore, we know that pi times diameter in this case equals 6.28. In order to solve my equation for the diameter, I'm going to replace pi with the value 3.14. This allows me to divide both sides of the equation by 3.14 in order to solve for d, which is 2. Now that I have the diameter, I can divide it by 2 to find the radius, which in this case would be 1. And now that I have the radius, I can plug it back into the formula for area. So pi r squared, in this case, would be pi times 1 squared. Of course, 1 squared equals 1, so I could also just write that as pi, or its value, 3.14, and it would be square units because we're dealing here with area. And finally, you may be asked to calculate the area of a shape that is only part of a circle. So once again, however, we start with what we know. We know that area equals pi r squared, and we know that in this case, the radius equals 8. However, in this case, we're not being asked to find the area of an entire circle. We're being asked to find the area of a shape that is 1/4 of a circle. So in this case, we're only taking 1/4 of whatever the value of pi r squared is. So let's plug our radius 8 into the formula. Now we have 1/4 times pi times the radius 8 squared. 8 squared equals 64, so I'm going to rearrange this a little bit to read 1/4 times 64 times pi. Now at this point you have some options for calculation. You could put 64 times 3.14 into the calculator and then divide that by 4 because order doesn't matter in multiplication. However, what I've chosen to do is to first calculate 1/4 of 64, which is 16, so my new expression reads 16 times pi. So I could input 16 times pi, or at that point I can multiply 16 by 3.14, and I would get 50.24. And again, area, so square units.